Have you heard of, I think this is another thing that Kripal was telling me about, but there's a phenomena with young children having memories of previous lives. And they're having memories of like violence in previous lives or violent deaths. And he is connecting, he made a connection to trauma. So like like violent or extremely physical or emotional traumatic experiences having to do with this brain filter opening up, right, and letting in more. And there's been many people, some of which I've had on the show before, who have had lives filled with trauma and just terrible, terrible childhoods that now have these crazy paranormal, phenomenal, unexplainable experiences in their daily lives. And these children, going back to these children who claim to have memories of previous lives, they were overwhelmingly male in their previous lives. And the reason Jeff believes, his idea of why this is because in the past, in history, males were far more likely to die violent deaths than females.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You're getting into the topic of, in the scholarly literature, they call it cases of reincarnation experience or core, but that's basically pointing at reincarnation.
Right. And it's interesting that children have it. It's children that are like on the cusp. It's before they actually learn language. Yeah. Before they can actually speak and have a conversation in whatever language they're going to learn, right? Like there's some weird little pocket there where before their consciousness gets like hardwired to society or something.
And while that's absolutely fascinating, I would say there's been some very good, serious research, in addition to what Dr. Kripal's been describing. There's a Dr. Ian Stevenson that has done a great deal of study about this cases of reincarnation experience. There's literally been hundreds of these types of experiences identified in research like this, and I think it offers a very strong, compelling argument. But you're right, mainly it's children, and often very young children. Other researchers are seeing that too. They remember their prior lives. Interestingly, as these very young children get older, they seem to lose that that memory, and so they don't really retain it. It's very unusual. One reason I'm so fascinated about that is we have this concept of reincarnation quite regularly expressed in near-death experiences. And I'm going to admit this, okay? When I started my near-death experience research, I thought, no way, reincarnation doesn't make any sense. I didn't believe in that stuff at all. However, I'm led by evidence, and so over and over, and we're talking about way over 100, hundreds at this point of near-death experiences I've studied, do talk about remembrance of a prior life. Now, in my reincarnation evidence in near-death experiences, there's not that predisposition for males. They say their prior life or lives that they remember. Interestingly, even if they're a male or female in this life, they may have been a male or female in prior lives, but or had multiple sort of different genders, often going back. So I'm not really seeing that preponderance of males. And also in near-death experiences, there's not that preponderance of remembrance of a traumatic death. When you have reincarnation discussed in near-death experiences, and maybe that's the explanation, they're just living mundane lives. I mean, I wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it if everybody talked about that they were Cleopatra in a prior life. Well, you just don't see that in near-death experiences. When they do remember and have some details of their prior life, I mean, they're very mundane, very what you would have expected from decades to centuries ago. Nothing what we'd call particularly special, but it is that remembrance, and often a very detailed remembrance of their life or prior lives. So again, near-death experiences times now hundreds, providing some further lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience. And I guess to convince myself, because I was such a skeptic of reincarnation, I guess I kind of looked at it from the point of view that if you really believe we're in a universe of infinite possibility, then to say something is impossible or can't happen, well, you're on thin ice. And so I think that's part of the rationale that if we're really in a universe where anything's possible, well, that would by definition, include reincarnation. And now with near-death experiences and Dr. Cripple and other researchers, there's some really pretty solid evidence that that really happens.
Have you ever dealt with like a young child who had a near-death experience? Mm-hmm. Did those differ from older people?
Well, glad you asked, because I've actually studied that. So I am very curious as a researcher about whether near-death experiences in very young children, my study group was age 5 and younger. The median and average age was 3.5 years old. These are very young children. And shoot, Danny, they're practically a cultural blank slate at that young age.
Right.
I mean, gosh, they almost certainly don't have any well-formed religious beliefs. They wouldn't understand death. They've almost certainly not heard about near-death experiences at that tender young age. So when people have a near-death experience at that young age, my interest as a researcher was, well, what about the content of these experiences? How does that compare to older children and adults? So I looked at 33 elements or questions in my survey that were related to what actually happens during the near-death experience in a group of, I believe it was like 23 that we found that were in that group, compared to older children and adults. And to my astonishment, I found there was no statistical difference in the response to any of those 33 questions. So amazingly, very young children seem to have identical near-death experiences as older children and adults. And in fact, there was a Dr. Sutherland who reviewed all prior literature about children's near-death experiences. Her conclusion, as with mine, is that there doesn't seem to be in any way any effect of even very young age on the content of a near-death experience.
That's interesting.
I do want to emphasize, for the very, very young children, I mean, they're a lot more likely, for instance, to have a loving presence with them. There may be, you see sometimes a little bit of a hint or a signal that they're having this at a very young age when they don't have a lot of prior life,
right?
And to remember to recall. But as far as the actual things that occur during a near-death experience, out-of-body experience, encountering deceased loved ones, light, awareness of love, et cetera, then it's, again, strikingly similar to older children and adults.
So what sort of after effects do these people experience after their NDE?
Well, as you can imagine, having such a profound experience generally affects people very, very deeply and very much affects them for the rest of their life. Interestingly, I'm just now putting the final touches on a manuscript, an article, which is going to be the largest study of near-death experiences ever reported. It's that group of 834 near-death experiencers that completed our most recent version of the survey that we have. So I looked specifically at changes in values, changes in beliefs, changes in belief about God. And in this study, I compared it to a group of 42 people that had a life-threatening event but did not have an experience at the time of their life-threatening event, and looked at how their values and beliefs changed, their belief about God. So what we're finding in this study with pending publication is the people that had a near-death experience had much more profound changes in their values and belief. They were much more compassionate. They were much less materialistic. They were much more much more literally changed. They had a much higher belief in God, a much higher belief in the reality of an afterlife as compared to that group that nearly died but didn't have a near-death experience. So it shows that near-death experiences and these often profound changes, what we call after effects, is not due so much, in fact hardly at all, to that life-threatening event, but it's due to the fact that they had that very profound mystical, spiritual experience that seems to have guided them in changing, often radically, throughout the rest of their life.
What do you think happens to these souls when people die?
Sure. Looking at near-death experiences, times 4,000, I've seen descriptions of separation from the physical body. Interestingly, most of the time they feel relieved to be apart from the physical body. They're free. They're immaterial, movement is non-physical, that what's often horrifically painful event that led to their near-death experience is gone. Immediately they don't have any of that pain, and they often feel like this is their real self, which I think is very revealing. But then when they go on and have described an afterlife, there's basically a realm, other beings. The one most common word that has been used by people that have near-death experiences to describe what occurred during the experience is love. So generally they feel overwhelming sense of love, of peace, in this, well, we call it unearthly realm, but hey, most near-death experiencers feel, or often describe, that feels like the real home. And interestingly, in that relatively small percentage of people having a near-death experience, when they're in that unearthly, beautiful realm, often with deceased loved ones, movements, non-physical, communication, telepathic, in that minority of people having NDEs that are given a choice about whether they want to stay there or return to their earthly body, the great majority do not want to return to their earthly body, which is amazing. Think about that. Friends, family, loved ones, everything that they knew, all that they were, typically for decades, they're willing to literally be apart from. And that's how enveloping, how deeply, profoundly beautiful that sense of love, that sense of connection, that sense of it being their real home, that's how deep it is for people having a near-death experience. And that's actually awkward because sometimes if they recover and have decided, at least initially that they didn't want to return to their earthly body, but then later decide they do, that's very awkward to share with their spouse. And we've run across a bunch of people that, if they're honest about sharing that experience, and people generally are, they have to explain to their spouse, no, you can't understand that that's my real home. You'll be there too. We'll all be together there. But, that was, and sometimes spouses are of the person that had the near-death experience can be very put out and unhappy and disappointed that they were so willing to leave. I get that. I've seen that I think probably hundreds of times.
Really?
So it's a minority of near-death experiences given a choice, but by the time you have over 4,000 near-death experiences, even uncommon ones, events like that, or you see a lot of.
How many of the 4,000 were given a choice?
Oh, I'd have to estimate because I haven't.
Yeah, if you were just to guess.
Yeah, I would say it's probably somewhere between 5 and 10%. Probably 10% would be my ballpark figure. Yeah, so it's not unusual. Most of the time, the significant majority, they're simply sent back involuntarily. There's not a dialogue or not a choice given. But for that minority, there's and what's fascinating too is when they're given a choice, there's often a great deal of dialogue. I mean, again, the great majority of people having a near-death experience do not want to return to that earthly physical body shell. They want to stay in that area of freedom, non-physical, acceleration of consciousness, profound feeling of love and peace beyond anything they knew on earth. So not surprisingly, they will do it. But the dialogue is fascinating. There can be a great deal of discussion with other beings there. They literally can argue about wanting to stay there. So it's fascinating what leads to, and I've actually have studied that in a small series, about why ultimately when they had a choice and at least initially did not want to return to their physical body, well, why did they ultimately decide to do that? And so probably the number one thing that in this small series was for children. If they had children, especially young children, that was a pretty compelling reason for them to come back. But also another reason would be your work's not done on Earth. You have more things to do. You have more things to experience. One thing that is crystal clear in near-death experiences is that our earthly lives, however difficult they are profoundly meaningful and significant. And so as part of the decision about returning, that may be sort of a reason for many, is that they have more to live, their earthly life is important, so boom, they make that decision to return.
Are there any accounts in the people that have submitted on your website that are similar to Elizabeth Crohn's superpowers that she claims to have, these precognition abilities and abilities to predict things that happen in the future?
Yeah. We have quite a few of people that have submitted, and in fact, we even ask a survey question. During your near-death experience, for example, did you become aware of future events? Now, that's sort of a mishmash, and I was hoping we could find something where I could say, wow, they made a prediction or had an awareness of a future event, but it's not really convincing enough that me scientifically can say that that's a common part of near-death experiences. But many people, like Elizabeth, have, after their experience, it's sort of an after effect that they have a strong sense that they're aware of, or can precognitive abilities, premonition abilities, psychic abilities. So we do see that again. It's not common, but enough people have described that I think it's fascinating. Again, I know Elizabeth personally, and for her, yeah, I think she's the real thing.
What do you think's happening there? How's that? Do you have any speculation?
And I don't even know that people that have these special abilities know for sure. They just know before their near-death experience they didn't have that ability. After their experience, they do. So I think it's one of those things they just accept it as a gift, something that how they changed. And I don't know that they can nail down a specific physical brain function. I don't know that there's a definite explanation. It's just observational. It changed, and that's their new ability.
I wonder if it has something to do, if you believe the brain filter hypothesis, if some part of the brain maybe got broke, right? Or some part of the brain permanently got tweaked, and now your filter's a little bit broke, and now you can now you can do more. Now you can see more.
Yeah, that is just about the best possible explanation that I think anybody could come up with. You really are more open to those. First of all, people that have a near-death experience and start having those abilities, they may have thought it was impossible that would happen, and yet, boom, all of a sudden, they're having it. So I think it's one of those things, having an openness to the possibility of that happen is probably essential for them to actually experience it. And then a lot of it is confidence building. You have that sort of psychic ability, and you sort of like right after your near-death experience, you're sort of testing the waters. Is this real? Is this possible? But I think for these very special people that have those changes, and they test it and they find that it's real, then that becomes a confidence builder, and then ultimately they can share it with the world and share it fearlessly that, yes, I really have this very special ability. And certainly it could be that pulling away of the filter after their near-death experience, or sort of after effect of openness that keeps them certainly more aware of and more predisposed to have these kinds of unusual psychic experiences.
Have you ever heard of a guy named Gary Nolan?
I dimly remind me of.
Yeah, he's at the Stanford, and he has done studies on I believe it's a fairly large group of people that experience different things, from paranormal experiences to UFO phenomena.
Okay.
And he basically scanned their brains and tried to find any kind of correlating evidence. And what he did find was that there was a specific part of the brain in the caudate putamen, I believe, called the basal ganglia. I might be butchering this, but
no, you got
a specific part of the brain that he says that the neurons in this basal ganglia are far more dense than the average person. And he said that was something that was common throughout all these people that were witnessing these experiences. So his idea is maybe that is part of this, whatever's going on in that basal ganglia. And I forgot what the purpose of that part of the brain is, but maybe you can find that, Steve. What does the caudate putamen basal ganglia do? But why would that part of the brain, being so far more dense with neurons, have something to do with being able to witness phenomena like paranormal or UFO stuff?
Yeah. That's a great question. And first of all, that raises an important issue. We need to be doing more of that type of research, functional brain imaging. We have several different mechanisms by which we can now image brain and its function and locations in the brain better than we ever did before as technology marches on.
Right.
But it's interesting when they have that well-developed part of the brain in people that have those types of experiences, psychic, UFOs, more developed in that part of the brain than other people's brains. What I think about as a scientist, is that cause or effect?
Exactly.
And so, is it something that because their brain was more developed than average, is that predispose them to an experience? Or did they have the experience and then in their processing, thinking about it, developing learning from that experience, did that result in that brain getting more developed? So it's really, again, a good example of where research like that is at the leading edge frontier, and I sure hope we see a lot more of that, because once again, what we don't know about that kind of phenomena and brain function and correlates far exceeds what we do know.
Right. I just remembered too, I had a guy in here a couple months ago who was an Army Ranger. He got shot in the head during some military training, but he was wearing a helmet. So the helmet flew off and it knocked him off his feet, and he had a near-death experience. And when he came back, he had to go get some psychological evaluation when he got back to the States, and he had severe head trauma. And after that, he got admitted to the CIA's remote viewing program, and he started doing remote viewing and training people in remote viewing. And he was explaining this all to me, and it was incredible. And a lot of these people had similar experiences where once they had like a crazy life-altering event, whether it be a head injury or a near-death experience, these people were getting admitted to these black projects doing remote viewing. And I know Bigelow is really interested in remote viewing too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is just yet another vivid example you bring up there of what we don't know about human consciousness, and the potential far outweighs what we do know. I mean, absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I know some people that were in the military remote viewing program. I know two of them personally, actually. And so as with you, I'm intrigued. Again, you just wonder, more about that. A good example where we need more research. We need to have more people studying those rare people that have that gift, and just seeing what its strengths are, what its limitations are.
Yeah, it's just, it seems like there is an elevated conscious realm that exists, that people have the ability to tap into, that is completely separate from our sort of 2D reality plane of existence down here. That is, it seems like once you experience that, it's world changing, because this sort of existence, or this, whatever this consciousness layer of consciousness is above us, above our plane of existence, it transcends culture, it transcends religion, it transcends nations, everything. And I can understand how that can really blow somebody's worldview out of the water. There's people that talk about the similarities of a DMT experience to this near-death experience. There was one guy in a video that I watched yesterday who was basically playing it out. He said he had a near-death experience when he was a kid, and he got in a car accident, and then he smoked DMT like 10 years later or something on a mountain, and he said he met the same exact entity and said, "You're not supposed to," he told him, he's like, "You're not supposed to be here." And have you ever experience or talk to people that have done both, smoked DMT and had an NDE?
We in the survey of over 4,000 people, we have scores that had a near-death experience and also described using psychotropic drugs. I mean, you name it, I've heard it: DMT, psilocybin, LSD, etc. So yeah, we have a fairly good-sized series of those. I think when you look at comparing DMT or other psychotropic drugs to near-death experiences, you have to be aware that there's a bit of a bias, in the sense that YouTube videos will become popular and you'll access them because they get a lot of clicks and they're interesting. And so that's interesting. They had a near-death experience and it was similar to DMT. However, in the hundreds, probably over 100 for sure, of people that have had near-death experiences and shared with our research website, and then discussed and compared the use of psychotropic brain-acting drugs to their near-death experience, the substantial majority say that they were grossly dissimilar. They may be slightly similar in the sense that it was unworldly.
Interesting.
They may have strong emotions associated with it. They may feel consciousness as a part, but the great majority, and again, that's all these are posted NDEs. Anyone on the world can look them up and see this. They're predominantly very, very different. Above and beyond that, I co-authored a scholarly paper, Dr. Parnia, and as part of that, we looked at near-death experiences and what occurred in near-death experiences, and that was virtually all derived from my nderf.org website, what occurs during experiences. And as part of that scholarly article published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, we had a group of the co-investigators look at all the scholarly literature on the effects of psychotropic drugs. So this was actually a scholarly review of published effects of both near-death experiences and psychotropic drugs. And once again, the conclusion of this published peer-reviewed paper was that they're substantially different. And if anyone has any doubt about that,
where can we find that paper?
It's at the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences about 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay.
But what anyone can do is go to the website erowid.org, EROWID, which is by far the largest collection of first-person experiences with psychotropic drugs by the scores. I mean, there's some I hadn't even heard of. But if you go there and look up DMT or psilocybin or some of the more popularly named substances that purportedly mimic near-death experiences, all you have to do is go there and then look up hundreds of first-person experiences, do exactly what I've done. Go there, read 20 or 30 first-person accounts of psilocybin or DMT, and I think anybody can easily see quickly that the experiences are very different. These psychotropic drugs are far more likely to be hallucinatory. Events in these psychotropic drug experiences skip around like dreams, no surprise.
DMT is in the top left, Steve.
Yeah, and also, in addition to that, you may find that DMT or psilocybin are more likely to be frightening, and they're more likely to be recognized as hallucinatory as opposed to near-death experiences where virtually all that have a near-death experience understand that it's real. So in spite of what you may see on YouTube or other media sites, this is the reality based on peer-reviewed public literature and actual first-person experiences posted on the website, and then coupled with people that actually had near-death experiences and hallucinatory experiences, but they're really different.
What is the idea that in death, or before death, the pineal gland secretes DMT that basically allows that person to have a psychedelic experience that essentially allows them to die? Is that the theory of what the purpose of the pineal gland is?
I would, while that's a theory, I would have to say lots of people have had cardiac arrest, their heart stopped, and then they're resuscitated and they come back to life. I mean, thank goodness we have thousands, probably tens of thousands of people, even here in America, that have survived that horrific close brush with death. I would say almost uniformly they don't come back and describe a hallucinatory experience associated with their heart stopping. So I think, while we still need to study the effects of the pineal or other brain chemistry mediators, there doesn't seem to be any resuscitation of these people that come back and describe something that would be a hallucinatory experience due to the pineal or anything else.
But these people who their heart stops, they do have NDEs.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
When the heart stops, a cardiac arrest, that's one of the more common listed precipitating events of a near-death experience. Near-death experience, in my research, you have to be near death. In other words, so physically compromised that you're unconscious or clinically dead, like happens when your heart stops. So to understand how amazing it is that they have a near-death experience at that time, you have to understand the, if you will, the physiology of your heart stopping. Well, obviously, immediately when your heart stops, immediately blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after blood stops flowing to the brain, the EEG, electroencephalogram, which is a measure of brain cortical electrical activity, goes absolutely flat.
Really? After 20 seconds?
10 to 20 seconds. That's very well documented in the literature. So after 10 to 20 seconds after your heart stops, there's no measurable brain cortical activity, which is where your higher cognitive consciousness is. So it should be physically impossible to have a conscious experience at that time, and yet by the hundreds, people report near-death experiences after their heart stops far beyond that 10 to 20 second interval prior to anybody beginning CPR or efforts at resuscitation. So again, it's just yet another one of the stronger lines of evidence that after your heart stops and you have a near-death experience, absolutely medically inexplicable for that to be due to physical brain function.
How do we know that the brain stops 20 seconds after the heart stops? Like, how many people have we measured with an EEG on their head when their heart stops?
There's quite a bit of literature in the medical various medical journals. I've actually cited that. These are big enough series that's generally accepted as being factual.
That just seems like a crazy thing to study, right?
Well, that's,
like, how would you be able to time that, to have an EEG on somebody and to be measuring their brain, knowing their heart's going to stop?
Well, it could be people, they're in the hospital, they're having some neurologic situation, they have an EEG on. Actually, interestingly, there was a very recent study by Dr. Parnia called the AWARE-2 study, where they actually went out of their way to measure the EEG in people that, in a fairly good-sized series, that had a cardiac arrest. So that's by far the largest contemporary series of actual EEG measurements, and that was done prospectively. So that was published relatively recently, and they actually had targets placed, and they were hoping that people among these cardiac arrest patients would have a near-death experience and be able to spot a target with their consciousness apart from the body. Unfortunately, in this large study, basically only several people had a near-death experience, and they weren't actually in that group having their EEG being measured. But among those that had cardiac arrest that did have an EEG being measured, unfortunately none of them had a near-death experience. So it wasn't really conclusionary,
okay.
But you did know that, again, like we knew from prior research, once you have a cardiac arrest, your measured brain cortical electrical activity is either flat or so disorganized that it should be absolutely impossible to have any lucid organized experience.